In this section, we're going to be looking at the aquatic biomes. We've already talked about the terrestrial biomes. That's what you did your brochures on. So now we're going to be looking at some of the aquatic biomes. When we look at the ocean, of course, the ocean covers about 72% of the Earth. We've already seen that the ocean controls the climate, controls the heating and cooling. We're also going to see that the ocean actually produces most of the Earth's oxygen that we breathe. It also is a big consumer to carbon dioxide. Later on, we're going to be talking about the carbon cycle, and the ocean plays a very important part in that. Start looking at the aquatic
and when we
biomes,
look at aquatic biomes, of course, we see that 75% of the Earth
covered in water
is made out of
the ocean.
We have lakes, rivers, estuaries, 75% of the Earth is covered in water, so water's obviously
oceanic,
pelagic,
we've already seen that the oceans play a role in the climate.
The oceans,
as far as
actually keep
controlling
the
the
climate
cool
on the
because
Earth.
of the. We're also going to see that it plays a very important part in oxygen distribution or production of oxygen and consuming a lot of our carbon dioxide. Here's a diagram of the actual ocean. We're talking about the intertidal zone. Of course, the intertidal zone is that area where you have low tide and high tide. It's that area between there. Most of the beaches we go to, Orange Beach, Gulf Shores, of course, this is where you put your chairs, where you lay out on the sand. Not a lot's going on, but in other places of the world, this intertidal zone may be as much as 20 to 30 feet, and it's a very harsh area, or microclimate for organisms there. We're also going to be talking about the photic zone. The photic zone is that part of the ocean where the sunlight penetrates. Obviously, this is where you have a lot of your plankton. Again, the plankton is actually what produces the oxygen. We're also going to be looking at the aphotic zone. The aphotic zone is that part of the ocean where sunlight does not penetrate. Not a lot of life in this area, but there is still some life. The benthic zone, what it means by the benthic zone, that is the area, the bottom of the ocean. We have the abyssal zone. The abyssal zone is the deepest part of the ocean out in the ocean. It's the flat part. You may have mountains or whatever due to volcanoes. And with the abyssal zone, of course, you also have trenches, which are the deepest parts of the ocean. Here we're looking at coral reefs, and coral reefs are considered the rainforest of the ocean. Of course, they are endangered, so they are protected by laws. If you ever get the opportunity to snorkel around a coral reef, I would suggest doing it. Of course, we've seen that coral reefs, from our video, the coral reefs, they need high salinity, they need very clear water, and because of clear cutting and stuff on land, we do have problems. Notice that they are restricted to the tropics, but also notice that here around Brazil, you do not have any coral reefs, and that's because of the Amazon actually emptying out, and the Amazon, of course, brings a lot of silt and also fresh water. This would be a very large estuary part, and you just don't see coral reefs around estuaries. We do have some in the Caribbean. The Caribbean actually does an excellent job of protecting them. Of course, the largest reef is over off the coast of Australia, and it's called the Great Barrier Reef, and it's out in this area here. When we start talking about freshwater terms, of course, again, we still have the photic zone where sunlight penetrates. We also have the aphotic zone. The aphotic zones where sunlight does not penetrate. So we're still going to see all of that. But also freshwater and saltwater, very different organisms, okay? Most organisms cannot handle both freshwater and saltwater. They are made for one or the other and not both. This is a oligotrophic lake. Oligotrophic just means nutrient poor. They appear clear because they lack the phytoplankton and nutrients at the surface. Normally, they're very deep and very cold. You find them in the up in the northern areas. It's not like our lakes here because we do have so much life. Even though the sunlight penetrates, and it actually penetrates the whole way, but they are just so cold that there's not very good growing seasons in these areas. Here we have a eutrophic lake. Of course, a eutrophic lake is a lake that does have a lot of life due to the warm waters and due to the sunlight penetrating. Here you get a lot of phytoplankton, a lot of dissolved nutrients, and this is more so like the lakes here that we have in our area. Here we're talking about streams and or stream headwaters. We're talking about rivers and streams. If you get an opportunity to hike this spring, hiking around some of the nature preserves, of course you'll see some of the little creeks and streams. The Walls of Jericho over in Jackson County, a difficult hike, but yet a very fun hike if you get the opportunity to go over there. I would suggest if you do it, make sure you have adults around. But if you get an opportunity to go up on Montesano and hike, this is what you're looking at. And of course, there's a lot of life there. It draws a lot of organisms because they need the water. So, you know, if you're lucky enough, you may actually see some wildlife when you're hiking in these spots. You have the midstream. The midstream, of course, is located between the mountains and the coast. This is your big rivers. If you go to the Tennessee River, this is essentially what you're talking about. Going back to the headwaters, of course, we're talking more about where you do your whitewater rafting up on the Ocoee, up on Montesano. You know, they're very cold normally because, you know, it is very clean water. Here in the midstream, of course, the water's moving much slower. We do a lot of kayaking around on some of the rivers, and this is the midstream. And then here you have estuaries, and estuaries are a very important part of our wetlands area. We've already talked about the areas in Louisiana, but estuaries are where fresh and saltwater meet. You saw that in our reading of Louisiana. The reason estuaries are so important is because a lot of our sea life, our shrimp, our oysters, when they're babies, they can't handle the very high salinity of the ocean. An estuary, because there's so much fresh water, it has lowered salinity. So these guys will actually come in. This is where they're born. They're called they're actually called estuarine dependent, which means that they must live part of their life in the estuary. They're euryhaline. In some ways, euryhaline means that they can withstand both fresh and salt water. But if we saw with Hurricane Katrina what wetlands do. Wetlands, of course, absorb storms, absorb the energy from the storms, and so estuaries play a vital part not only to our existence, but to seafood's existence. The largest estuary in the state of Alabama is Mobile Bay, and it's actually the 5th largest by volume in the United States. So we do have a very nice estuary. Here we're talking about the wetlands and the swamp. This would be like in Louisiana. We saw that wetlands and swamps, of course, we've already talked about it. They actually decrease the storm surge. They actually dissipate hurricanes. And we are losing our wetlands because of erosion. And as the wetlands go away and they get flooded, we lose a lot of our wetlands, the trees die. Storms are just going to be worse and worse in our coastline. This last picture here is of the marsh areas. The marsh, of course, are the wetlands area made up of the grasses. Again, we talked quite a bit about those during our Hurricane Katrina section. And again, these areas dissipate storm energy, and they actually help save the mainland. And as we do away with these wetlands area, of course, storms are going to be worse, which is going to cause more erosion on land. And this brings us to the end of our aquatic biomes.